At the beginning of the film, it showed a group of search and rescue team looking for mountaineers who were lost in the middle of a stormy forest. After searching for a long time, the SAR team boarded a helicopter and reported that the storm was getting more extreme, so they had to quickly take cover and stop their search. Meanwhile, a man on horseback continued his search, even though he knew that the flash flood was getting closer. The man on horseback was a legendary former war veteran from Vietnam named John. Not long after that, John found a mountaineer, but unfortunately, John found him dead. After that, John continued his search until finally, he found two hikers who were still alive. John immediately asked them both to take shelter because the flash flood was getting closer. But one male hiker refused because he wanted to first look for his wife, who was still left behind. Shortly, John managed to save a climber with him. Meanwhile, the male climber, who stubbornly wanted to look for his wife, now he has been found dead. A few days later, John was seen horse riding in his yard. John, who used to be a war veteran, now preferred to be a horse breeder and lived in Arizona, bordering Mexico. John lived there with his older sister, Maria, and his niece. John asked Maria where his niece was, then Maria answered that she was out and in a moment, she would be here soon. After that, John went downstairs to a room because apparently he had an underground tunnel which he had used as a base. Up to this moment, John still remembered what happened during the war in Vietnam. Several hours later, when John was making a mashate, he was suddenly approached by his niece, Gabriella. Gabriella is John's niece, whom he has looked after since childhood, so John also considered Gabriella his own daughter. Here, Gabriella invited John to ride horses because there was something she wanted to ask. Then, when the two of them were on the field, Gabriella asked if John knew where Gabriella's biological father was. John answered that he didn't know, but Gabriella had to believe that her father didn't want her anymore. Hearing this, Gabriella was so sad, especially since her mother had died when she was little. Gabriella then asked John for permission that tonight she really wanted to invite her friends to a party in John's underground tunnel. John, who didn't want to make Gabriella even sadder, didn't hesitate to agree to it. In the evening, Gabriella invited her friends to party in John's underground tunnel. Meanwhile, John and Maria were seen chatting and hoping that Gabriella would enjoy the party. Then, in the middle of the party, Gabriella got a call from her female friend who now lives in Mexico. It turned out that her friend wanted to tell Gabriella that she had just found the address of Gabriella's biological father's house. Long story short, when all of Gabriella's friends had gone home, John immediately met Gabriella, who at that time was cleaning up bottles. Here, Gabriella said that her female friend who now lives in Mexico had just found out her biological father's home address, so Gabriella asked John for permission so that John would allow her to go to Mexico to meet her father. Apparently, Gabriella really wanted to ask her father directly about why he had the heart to leave her. Hearing this, John really understood what Gabriella wanted, but John asked her to be patient because in 4 days she had to go to school. John promised that on the next holiday, he would take Gabriella to meet her father. The next morning, John caught Gabriella and Maria, who were arguing. Gabriella still insisted on meeting her father in Mexico that day, but Maria forbade it because Maria knew the character of Gabriella's father. Maria also told her that when Gabriella's mother was dying in the hospital, Gabriella's father suddenly came and actually abused Gabriella's mother and didn't want to admit Gabriella as his daughter. At this situation, John tried to calm them both down and John firmly forbade Gabriella to go. In the end, Gabriella wanted to give up on her plans, but tonight she would stay in the next village with her friends. That afternoon, Gabriella was seen going to another village and she apologized to John for the commotion this morning. When Gabriella was about to go to the next village, she suddenly turned the car around and it turned out she still wanted to go to Mexico to meet her father. A few hours later, Gabriella finally arrived in Mexico because Gabriella lives in Arizona, which borders Mexico. In short, Gabriella met her friend who lives in Mexico, Giselle. Giselle was the person who contacted Gabriella last night and told her the home address of Gabriella's father. After they chatted for a long time, Giselle immediately invited Gabriella to go to town because that's where Gabriella's father was. At night, the two of them finally arrived near Gabriella's father's house. Here, Giselle told Gabriella to come down and meet her father, while Giselle would still wait in the car. When Gabriella knocked on the door, her father came out, and he was a little surprised when he suddenly saw Gabriella come to him. Then, Gabriella explained that she came here just to ask why her father had the heart to leave her. The father answered that he already had a new family when Gabriella was born and her mother died, so the father didn't want to take care of Gabriella, including considering Gabriella as his daughter. Hearing this explanation, of course, Gabriella was very heartbroken, and she went back to the car to meet Giselle. Gabriella planned to go straight home to Arizona, but Giselle forbade her because it was very late. Giselle didn't want to see Gabriella sad, so she finally took Gabriella to a nightclub in the city. When they were in the nightclub, suddenly Gabriella was invited to chat by a man named Sober, who was a subordinate of a cartel mafia boss. Apparently, Sober wanted to kidnap Gabriella, so he mixed Gabriella's drink with something. The scene switches to showing Sober's boss, a person who wears a black suit named Hugo. At that time, Hugo was talking to the corrupt police chief to discuss their illegal business. Not long after, Hugo approached his younger brother, Victor. Hugo asked Victor to prepare some new women to accompany the members of the police. It was discovered that apart from selling narcotics, they also committed prostitution business. That afternoon, Victor went to see the women who had been kidnapped, and Gabriella was also there. Victor threatened them to never run away because if they were caught, Victor would not hesitate to torture them. Victor also told some of the women to prepare themselves because the police wanted to meet them. On the other hand, Maria came to John and said that Giselle, Gabriella's friend from Mexico, just gave her the news that Gabriella had disappeared after meeting her father. Hearing this, John was certainly very shocked because as far as he knew, Gabriella said goodbye to the next village instead of going to Mexico. Then Maria gave Gabriella's father's house address, as well as Giselle's house address. Without wasting any time, John immediately left for Mexico. Shortly, John arrived at Gabriella's father's house. Here, John shouted and threatened Gabriella's father, asking where Gabriella was now. Gabriella's father understood that John was quite a brutal person, so he swore that he did not know Gabriella's whereabouts. After that, John met Giselle to find out what really happened. Giselle said that previously, she and Gabriella had gone to Gabriella's father's house, and then Giselle had taken Gabriella to a nightclub. From there, she had separated from Gabriella, and until now, Gabriella had not returned. After telling the chronology, John suddenly became angry when he saw Gabriella's bracelet in Giselle's hand, because it meant that Giselle had deliberately sold Gabriella. Then, John forced Giselle to show him who had taken Gabriella. Giselle was afraid of John, so in the end, she immediately took John to a place. At the nightclub, Giselle told John that she had sold Gabriella to one of the cartel mafia boss's men, Sober. After finding out who it was, John asked Giselle to leave while he was looking for an opportunity to paralyze Sober. Not long after that, Sober finally left with a woman. Then, when Sober was about to get into the car, suddenly John attacked him. John showed Gabriella's photo while asking where she was now. At first, Sober didn't want to say anything until John, who was feeling angry, immediately tortured him. Unable to stand the torture, Sober finally wanted to take John to Gabriella's place. Meanwhile, Victor brought the corrupt policemen to see the girls. Those policemen immediately chose the girls they liked, including Gabriella. The scene showed John and Sober, who finally arrived at the place. After Sober showed the place, John immediately beat him until he was unconscious. After that, John walked towards the place Sober had said, but on one occasion, it turned out that John was caught by the mafia members. John was immediately led to a certain place, and finally, they surrounded John. Here, John couldn't do anything, considering that there were 100 mafias. Then, they took John's wallet, so they found out that John was from Arizona. Besides, they also found a photo of Gabriella. After finding out that John's goal was to save Gabriella, they didn't hesitate to immediately torture John. When John was helpless, Hugo, the mafia boss, told Victor to put a mark on John's face, and they didn't have to kill John. This was done so that everyone out there knew that they weren't just any mafia. A few hours later, when things were quiet, John was suddenly found by a journalist. The journalist immediately took John to her house for immediate treatment. 1 week later, John finally woke up and he was quite shocked, wondering why he was at the journalist's house. The journalist said that she found John lying helpless in the mafia area led by Hugo. Apparently, the journalist had been spying on them for a long time. She even kept a photo of Hugo and Victor. This was because the journalist's sister had also been kidnapped by them, and her sister was found dead due to overdose. When hearing this explanation, John was also immediately afraid that Gabriella would have the same fate, so John asked the journalist to help him. John really wanted to know where he could find Gabriella. This journalist has been watching them for a long time, so she didn't hesitate to tell John. Before leaving, John asked why she didn't report to the police. Then she answered that the police chief in this area has conspired with the mafia. Long story short, John went to the brothel because the journalist was sure that Gabriella would definitely be there. John pretended to be a customer, and without further ado, he killed all of Hugo's men. In the end, John found Gabriella, who looked pathetic because she had been fed a lot of drugs. Then, John immediately took Gabriella home to Arizona that night. On the way, John gave Gabriella's bracelet back, saying that caring for Gabriella was the best thing in his life. Hearing this, Gabriella could only apologize because if she had obeyed John's words, she would not have been like this. Not long afterward, Gabriella suddenly breathed her last breath due to an overdose. In the morning, John arrived home, and he immediately told Maria if Gabriella had been found, but now she was dead. In short, John had buried Gabriella, and it was clear that he seemed devastated by this incident. Then, John asked Maria to leave John's house, but this was not without reason, because John was going to take revenge on Hugo's group. John planned to finish them off. After Maria left, John immediately made weapons, such as assembling bombs and arrows. Not only that, John also started making traps because he was going to lure Hugo's group to come to his house. That night, John returned to Mexico to meet the journalist. Here, John said that he would take revenge on Hugo and his gang. Then, John asked the journalist to tell him where Victor's house was. After that, the journalist gave Victor's house address to John and asked him to bring them a painful death. In short, John arrived at Victor's house. Armed with combat experience, John without the slightest difficulty finished off the guards there, including Victor. The next day, Hugo, the mafia boss, came to Victor's house. Hugo was very surprised when he saw Victor, his younger brother, who had died very badly. It turned out that John had given Hugo a message by attaching Gabriella's photo so that Hugo's group would visit John's house in Arizona. Knowing this, Hugo immediately gathered all his men because they would fulfill the invitation from John. After preparing everything, Hugo and his men immediately rushed to Arizona. In the morning, they arrived at John's place, and Hugo immediately told his men to scatter. Meanwhile, John, who realized they had arrived, immediately welcomed them very warmly. After that, they got out of the car and started looking for John, but that's when John started to finish off some of them. After that, Hugo, who knew that John was in the underground tunnel, immediately ordered his men to go in. Here, Hugo asked his men to split up, but one by one, they were caught in a trap set by John. On one occasion, John could actually easily finish off Hugo. However, he deliberately let Hugo live because he had other plans. When John wanted to finish off Hugo's 3 men, it turned out they were able to hurt John. Long story short, John went upstairs and asked Hugo to come to see him because all of Hugo's men were already dead. John said that he had 10 chances to finish off Hugo, but he didn't do it. Apparently, John wanted Hugo to feel his anger first, and John would also remove Hugo's heart from his body. Then, John asked Hugo to follow the light because he would blow up the tunnel underground. In the end, Hugo managed to get out of the tunnel, but at the same time, John immediately shot Hugo down with an arrow until he was helpless. At this point, John stared at Hugo with a feeling of satisfaction, especially because Hugo looked very scared. John said that when Gabriella died, it was the same as Hugo had broken John's heart. So now, it was John's turn to break Hugo's heart. After finishing Hugo and all his troops, John went to the terrace of his house and sat in his rocking chair. Then the film ended with words from John. "I live in a world of death. I tried to get home from the battlefield, but feel like I never arrived because my mind is always there. My only family has now disappeared, but I will always fight so that their memories can always stay alive forever."